Chapter 28. Walkabout returned to Hearthstone, following his confrontation with the Grimpond, and for the better part of a week did nothing more than consider what he had been told. The weather was pleasant, the days warm and sunny, the air filled with fragrant smells from the woodland trees, flowers and streams. He felt sheltered by the valley. He was content to remain in seclusion there. Rumour provided all the company he required. The big moor cat trailed after him on the long walks he took to while away his days, padding silently down the solitary trails, along the moss-covered stream banks, through the ancient, massive trees, a soundless and reassuring presence. At night, the two sat upon the cottage porch, the cat dozing, the man staring skyward at the canopy of moon and stars. He was always thinking. He could not stop thinking. The memory of the Grimpond's words haunted him, even at Hearthstone, at his home, where nothing should have been able to threaten him. The words played in pleasant games within his mind, forcing him to confront them, to try to reason through how much of what they whispered was truth and how much a lie. He had known it would be like this before he had gone to see the Grimpond, that the words would be vague and distressing, and that they would speak riddles and half-truths, and leave him with a tangled knot of threads leading to the answers he sought. A knot that only a clairvoyant could manage to sort out. He had known, and still he was not prepared for how taxing it would be. He was able to determine the location of the Black Elfstone almost immediately. There was only one place where eyes could turn a man to stone and voices drive him mad. One place where the dead lay in utter blackness. The Hall of Kings, deep in the dragon's teeth. It was said that the Hall of Kings had been fashioned even before the time of the Druids, a vast and impenetrable cavern labyrinth in which the dead monarchs of the Four Lands were interred, a massive crypt which the living were not permitted, protected by darkness, by statues called sphinxes that were half man, half beast, and could turn the living to stone, and by formless beings called banshees, who occupied a section of the caverns called the Corridor of Winds, and whose wail could drive men mad instantly. And the tomb itself, where the pocket carved with runes hid the Black Elfstone, was watched over by the serpent Valg. At least it was, if the serpent was still alive. There had been a terrible battle fought between the serpent and the company under Alanon's leadership, who had gone in search of the sword of Shannara in the time of Scions. The company had encountered the serpent unexpectedly and been forced to battle its way clear. But no one had ever determined if the serpent had survived that battle, for as far as Walker knew, no one had ever gone back to see. Alanon might have returned once upon a time, of course, but Alanon had never said. The difficulty in any event was not in determining the mystery of the Elfstone's whereabouts, but in deciding whether or not to go after it. The Hall of Kings was a dangerous place, even for someone like Walker, who had less to fear than ordinary men. Magic, even the magic of a druid, might not be protection enough, and Walker's magic was far less than Alanon's had ever been. Walker was concerned as well with what the Grimpond hadn't told him. There was certain to be more to this than what had been revealed. The Grimpond never gave out everything it knew. It was holding something back, and that was probably something that could kill Walker. There was also the matter of the visions. There had been 3 of them, each more disturbing than the one before. In the first, Walker had stood on clouds above the others in the little company who had come to the Hadeshorn in the shade of Elenon, one hand missing, mocked by his own claim that he would lose that hand before he would allow the druids to come again. In the second, he had pushed to her death a woman with silver hair, a magical creature of extraordinary beauty. In the third, Elenon held him fast while death reached to claim him. There was some measure of truth in each of these visions, Walker knew. Enough truth so that he must pay heed to them and not simply dismiss them as the Grimpon's tauntings. The visions meant something. The Grimpon had left it to him to figure out what. So Walker debated. But the days passed, and still the answers he needed would not come. All that was certain was the location of the Black Elfstone, and its claim upon the Dark Uncle grew stronger, a lure that drew him like a moth to a flame, though the moth understood the promise of death that waited and flew to it nevertheless. And fly to it Walker did as well in the end, despite his resolve to wait until he had puzzled out the Grimpon's riddles. His hunger to reclaim the missing Elfstone finally overcame him. He had thought the conversation through until he was sick of repeating it in his mind. He became convinced that he had learned all from it that he was going to learn. There was no other course of action left to him but to go in search of the Black Elfstone, and to discover by doing what he could discover in no other way. It would be dangerous, but he had survived dangerous situations before. He resolved not to be afraid, only to be careful. He left the valley at the close of the week, departing with the sunrise, travelling afoot, wearing a long forest cloak for protection against the weather and carrying only a rucksack full of provisions. Most of what he would need, he would find on the way. He walked west into Darkland Reach and did not look back until Hearthstone was lost from view. Rumour remained behind. It was difficult to leave the big cat. Walker would have felt better having him along. Few things would challenge a full-grown moorcat, but it would be dangerous for Rumour as well outside the protective confines of the Eastland, where he could not conceal himself as easily, and where his natural protection would be stripped from him. Besides, this was Walker's quest, and his alone. The irony of his choosing to make the quest at all did not escape him. He was the one who had vowed never to have anything to do with the Druids and their machinations. He had gone grudgingly with Pa on his journey to the Hadeshorn. He had left the meeting with the Shade of Elenon convinced that the Druid was playing games with the Omspids, using them to serve his own hidden purposes. He had practically thrown Cogline from his own home, insisting that the other's efforts to teach the secrets of the magic had retarded his growth rather than enhanced it. He had threatened to take the Druid history that the old man had brought him and throw it into the deepest bog. But then he had read about their Black Elfstone, and somehow everything had changed. He still wasn't sure why. His curiosity was partly to blame, his insatiable need to know. Was there such a thing as the Black Elfstone? Could it bring back disappeared Paranor as the history promised? Questions to be answered. He could never resist the lure of their secrets. Such secrets had to be solved, their mysteries revealed. There was knowledge waiting to be discovered. It was the purpose to which he had dedicated his life. He wanted to believe that his sense of fairness and compassion made him go as well. Despite what he believed about the Druids, there might be something in Paranor itself. If, indeed, the Druids' keep could be brought back, that would help the Four Lands against the Shadowwind. He was uneasy with the possibility that in not going, he was condemning the races to a future like that which the druid shade had described. He promised himself as he departed that he would do no more than he must, and certainly no more than he believed reasonable. He would remain first and always his own master, rather than the plaything that Elanon's shade would have him be. The days were still and sultry, the summer's heat building as he traversed the forest wilderness. Clouds were massed in the west. Somewhere below the dragon's teeth, there would be storms waiting in the mountains. He passed along the charred rush, then climbed into the wolf's gag and out again. It took him 3 days of easy travel to reach Storlock. There he reprovisioned with the help of the stores, and on the morning of the 4th day set out to cross the Rab Plains. The storms had reached him by then, and rain began to fall in a slow, steady drizzle that turned the landscape grey. Patrols of Federation soldiers on horseback and caravans of traders appeared and faded like wraiths without seeing him. Thunder rumbled in the distance, muted and sluggish in the oppressive heat, a growl of dissatisfaction echoing across the emptiness. Walker camped that night on the Rab Plains, taking shelter in a cottonwood grove. There was no dry wood for a fire, and Walker was already drenched through, so he slept wrapped in his cloak, shivering with the damp and cold. Morning brought a lessening of the rains, the clouds thinning and letting the sun's brightness shine through in a screen of grey light. Walker roused himself stoically, ate a cold meal of fruit and cheese, and struck out once more. The dragon's teeth rose up before him, sullen and dark. He reached the pass that led upward into the valley of Shale and the Shannara, and beyond, the Hall of Kings. That was as far as he went that day. He made camp beneath an outcropping of rock where the earth was still dry. He found wood, built a fire, dried his clothes, and warmed himself. He would be ready now when tomorrow came, and it was time to enter the caverns. He had a hot meal and watched the darkness descend in a black pall of clouds, mist and night across the empty reaches about him. He thought for a time about his boyhood and wondered what he might have done to make it different. It began to rain again, and the world beyond his small fire disappeared. He slept well. There were no dreams, no nervous awakenings. When he awoke, he felt rested and prepared to face whatever fate awaited him. He was confident, though not carelessly so. The rain had stopped again. He listened for a time to the sounds of the morning waking around him, searching for hidden warnings. There were none. He wrapped himself in his forest cloak, shouldered his rucksack, and started up. The morning slipped away as he climbed. He was more cautious now, his eyes searching across the barren rock defiles and crevices for movement that meant danger, his ears sorting through the small noises and scrapes for those that truly menaced. He moved quietly, deliberately, studying the landscape ahead before proceeding into it, choosing its path with care. The mountains about him were vast, empty and still. Sleeping giants rooted so utterly by time to the earth beneath that even if somehow managed to wake, they would find they could no longer move. He passed into the valley of Shale. Black rock glistened damply within its bowl, and the waters of the Shannara stirred like a thick greenish soup. He circled it wearily and left it behind. Beyond, the slope steepened, and the climb grew more difficult. The wind began to pick up, blowing the mist away until the air was sharp and clear, and there was the only grey ceiling of the cloud between Walker and the earth. The temperature dropped, slowly at first, then rapidly, until it was below freezing. Ice began to appear on the rock, and snow flurries swirled past his face in small gusts. He wrapped his cloak about him more tightly and pressed on. His progress slowed then, and for a very long time it seemed to Walker as if he were not moving at all. The pathway was uneven and littered with loose stone, twisting and winding its way through the larger rocks. The wind blew into him remorselessly, biting at his face and hands, buffeting him so that it threatened to knock him backward. The mountainside remained unchanging, and it was impossible to tell at any given point how far he had come. He quit trying to hear or see anything beyond what lay immediately in front of him, and limited his concentration to putting one foot in front of the other, drawing into himself as far as he could to block away the cold. He found himself thinking of the Black Elfstone, of how it would look and feel, or what form its magic might take. He played with the vision in the silence of his mind, shutting out the world he travelled through, and the discomfort he was feeling. He held the image before him like a beacon and used it to brighten the way. It was noon when he entered a canyon, a broad split between the massive peaks with their canopy of clouds that opened into a valley, and beyond the valley into a narrow, twisting passageway that disappeared into the rock. Walker traversed the canyon floor to the defile and started in. The wind died away to a whisper, an echo that breathed softly in the suddenly enfolding stillness. Mist trapped by the peaks, collected and pulled. Walker felt the chill lose its bite. He came out of himself again, newly alert. Tense as he searched the dark rifts and corners of the corridor he followed. Then the walls fell away, and his journey was finished. The entrance to the Hall of Kings stood before him, carved into the wall of the mountains, a towering black maw, bracketed by huge stone sentries fashioned in the shape of armor-clad warriors. The blades of their swords jammed downward into the earth. The sentries faced out from the cavern mouth, faces scarred by wind and time, eyes fastened on Walker, as if they might somehow really see. Walker slowed, then stopped. The way forward was wrapped in darkness and silence. The wind, its echo still ringing in his ears, had faded away completely. The mist was gone. Even the cold had mutated into a sort of numbing, empty chill. What Walker felt at that moment was unmistakable. The feeling wrapped about him like a second skin, permeated his body, reached down into his bones. It was the feeling of death. He listened to the silence. He searched the blackness. He waited. He let his mind reach out into the void. He could discover nothing. The minutes faded away. Finally, Walker bow straightened purposefully, hitched up the rucksack, and started forward once again. It was mid-afternoon in the westland, where the turfing stretched from the sun-baked banks of the Myrmidon south along the broad, empty stretches of the Shroud Slip. The summer had been a dry one, and the grasses were withered from the heat, even where there had been a measure of shade to protect them. Where there had been no shade at all, the land was burned bare. Renomsford sat withered back against the trunk of a spreading oak, close to where the horses nosed into a muddy pool of water, and watched the sun's fire turn red against the western sky, edging toward the horizon in the day's close. The glare blinded her to anything approaching from that direction, and she shaded her eyes watchfully. It was one thing to be caught napping by dark. It was something else again to let her guard down against whoever it was that was tracking them. She pursed her lips thoughtfully. It had been more than 2 days now since they had first discovered that they were being followed. Sensed it, really, since their shadow had remained carefully hidden from them. He or she or it, they still didn't know. Garth had backtracked that morning to find out, stripping off his brightly coloured clothing and donning mud-streaked plains garb, shading his face, hands and hair, disappearing into the heat like a wraith. Whoever was tracking them was in for an unpleasant surprise. Still, it was nearing day's end and the giant rover hadn't returned. Their shadow might be more clever than they had imagined. What does it want? She mused to herself. She had asked Garth the same question that morning, and he had drawn his finger slowly across his throat. She tried to argue against it, but she lacked the necessary conviction. It could be an assassin following them as easily as anyone else. Her gaze wandered to the expanse of the plains east. It was disturbing enough to be tracked like this. It was even more disturbing to realize that it probably had something to do with her inquiries about the elves. She sighed, fitfully, vaguely irritated with the way things were working out. She had come back from a meeting with the Shade of Elanon in an unsettled state, dissatisfied with what she had heard, uncertain as to what she should do. Common sense told her that what the Shade had asked of her was impossible, but something else, that sixth sense she relied upon so heavily, whispered that maybe it wasn't, that druids had always known more than humans, that their warnings and chargings to the people of the race had always had merit. Pa believed he was probably already in search of the missing sword of Shannara. And while Walker had departed from them in a rage, vowing never to have anything to do with the druids, his anger had been momentary. He was too rational, too controlled to dismiss the matter so easily. Like her, he would be having second thoughts. She shook her head ruefully. She had believed her own decision irrevocable for a time. She had persuaded herself that common sense mustn't necessarily govern her course of action, and she had returned with Garth to her people, putting the business of Elanon and the missing elves behind her. But the doubts had persisted, a nagging sense of something being not quite right about her determination to drop the matter. So, almost reluctantly, she had begun to ask questions about the elves. It was easy enough to do so. The rovers were a migrating people and travelled the Westland from end to end during the course of a year's time, trading for what they needed, bartering with what they had. Villages and communities came and went, and there were always new people to talk to. And what harm could it do then to inquire about the elves? Sometimes she had asked her questions directly, sometimes almost jokingly, but the answers she had received were all the same. The elves were gone, had been since before anyone could remember, since before the time of their grandfathers and grandmothers. No one had ever seen an elf. Most weren't sure there had ever really been anyone to see. Wren had begun to feel foolish even asking, and had begun to consider giving up asking at all. She broke away from her people to hunt with Garth, anxious to be alone to think, hoping to gain some insight into the dilemma through solitary consideration of it. And then Shadow had appeared, stalking them. Now she was wondering if there wasn't something to be found out after all. She saw movement out of the corner of her eye, a vague blur in the swelter of the plains, and she came cautiously to her feet. She stood without moving in the shadow of the oak as the shape took form and became Garth. The giant rover trotted up to her, sweat coating his heavily muscled frame. He seemed barely winded, a tireless machine that even the intense midsummer heat could not affect. He sighed briefly, then shaking his head, whoever was out there had eluded him. Wren held his gaze a moment. then reached down to hand him the water skin. As he drank, she draped her lanky frame against the roughened bark of the oak and stared out into the empty plains. One hand came up in an unconscious movement to touch the small leather bag about her neck. She rolled the contents thoughtfully between her fingers. Make-believe Elfstones, her good luck charm. What sort of luck were they providing her now? She brushed aside her uneasiness, her sun-browned face, a mask of determination. It didn't matter. Enough was enough. She didn't like being followed. She was going to put an end to it. They would change the direction of their travel, disguise their trail, backtrack once or twice, ride all night if need be, and lose their shadow once and for all. She took her hand away from the bag and her eyes were fierce. Sometimes you had to make your own luck. Walkabout entered the Hall of Kings on cat's feet, passing noiselessly between the massive stone sentinel, stepping through the cavern mouth into the blackness beyond. He paused there, letting his eyes adjust. There was light, a faint greenish phosphorescence given off by the rock. He would not need to light a torch to find the way. A picture of the caverns flashed momentarily in his mind, a reconstruction of what he expected to find. Cogline had drawn it for him on a piece of paper long ago. The old man had never been into the caverns himself, but others of the Druids had, Alanon among them, and Cogline had studied the maps that they had devised and revealed their secrets to his pupil. Walker felt confident that he could find the way. He started ahead. The passageway was broad and level, its walls and floor free from sharp projections and crevices. The near dark was wrapped in silence, deep and hushed, and there was only the faint echo of his boots as he walked. The air was bone-chilling, a cold that had settled into the mountain rock over the centuries and could not be dislodged. It seeped into Walker despite his clothing and made him shiver. A prickling of unpleasant feelings crept through him. Loneliness, insignificance, futility. The caverns dwarfed him. They reduced him to nothing, a tiny creature whose very presence in such an ancient, forbidden place was an affront. He fought back against the feelings, recognizing what they would do to him. And after a brief struggle, they faded back into the cold and the silence. He reached the cave of the Sphinxes shortly after. He paused again, this time to steady his mind, to take himself deep down inside where the stone spirits couldn't reach him. When he was there, wrapped in whispers of caution and warning, blanketed in words of power, he went forward. He kept his eyes fixed on the dusty floor, watching the stone pass away, looking only at the next few feet he must cover. In his mind he saw the Sphinxes looming over him, massive stone monoliths, fashioned by the same hand that had made the Sentinel. The Sphinxes were said to have human faces carved on the bodies of beasts, creatures of another age that no living man had ever seen. They were old, so incredibly ancient that their lives could be measured by hundreds of generations of mortal men. So many dead monarchs had passed beneath their gaze, carried from life to endless rest within their mountain tombs. So many, and none had returned. "Look at us," they whispered. "See how wondrous we are." He could sense their eyes on him, hear the whispers of their voices in his mind, feel them tearing and ripping at the layers of protection he had fashioned for himself, begging him to look up. He moved more quickly now, fighting to banish the whispers, resisting the urge to obey them. The stone monsters seemed to howl at him, harsh and insistent. "Walkabout, look at us. You must." He struggled forward, his mind swarming with their voices, his resolve crumbling. Sweat beaded on his face despite the cold, and his muscles knotted until they hurt. He gritted his teeth against his weakness, chiding himself for it, thinking suddenly of Alanon and a bitter, desperate reminder that the druid had come this way before him with 7 men under his protection and had not given in. In the end, neither did he, just as he thought he would, that he must. He reached the far end of the cavern and stepped into the passageway beyond. The whispers faded and were gone. The sphinxes were left behind. He looked up again, carefully resisted the urge to glance back, then moved ahead once more. The passageway narrowed and began to wind downward. Walker slowed, uncertain as to what might lurk around the darkened corners. The greenish light could be found only in small patches here, and the corridor was thick with shadows. He dropped into a crouch, certain that something waited to attack him, feeling its presence grow nearer with every step he took. He considered momentarily using his magic to light the passageway so that he might better see what hid from him. But he quickly discarded the idea. If he invoked the magic, he would alert whatever might be there that he possessed special power. Better to keep the magic secret, he thought. It was a weapon that would serve him best if its use was unexpected. Yet nothing appeared. He shrugged his uneasiness aside and pressed on until the passageway straightened and began to widen out again. Then the sound began. He knew it was coming. They would strike all at once, and he still was not prepared when it came. It lashed out at him, wrapping about with the strength of iron chains, dragging him ahead. There was a scream of wind through a canyon, the howl and rip of storms across a plain, the pounding seas against shoreline cliff, and beneath, just under the skin of it, was the horrifying shriek of souls in unimaginable pain, scraping their bones against the rock of the cavern walls. Frantically, Walker brought his defences to bear. He was in the corridor of winds, and the banshees were upon him. He blocked everything away in an instant, closing off the terrifying sound with a strength of will that rocked him, focusing his thoughts on a single picture within his mind, an image of himself. He constructed the image with lines and shadings, colouring in the gaps, giving himself life and strength and determination. He began to walk forward. He muffled the sounds of the banshees until they were no more than a strange buzzing that whipped and tore about him, trying to break through. He watched the corridor of winds pass away about him, a bleak and empty cavern in which everything was invisible but the sound of the banshees wailing. A whirl of colour that flashed like maddened lightning through the black. Nothing Walker did would lessen it. The shrieks and howls hammered into him, buffeting his body as if they were living things. He could feel his strength ebbing as it had before the onslaught of the sphinxes, his defences giving way. The fury of the attack was frightening. He fought back against it, a hint of desperation creeping through him as he watched the image he had drawn of himself begin to shimmer and disappear. He was losing control. In another minute, maybe two, his protection would crumble completely. And then once again he broke clear, just when it seemed he must give way. He stumbled from the corridor of winds into a small cave that lay beyond. The screams of the banshees vanished. Walker collapsed against the closet wall, sliding down the smooth rock into a sitting position, his entire body shaking. He breathed in and out slowly, steadily, coming back to himself in bits and pieces. Time slowed, and for a moment he allowed his eyes to close. When he opened them again, he was looking at a pair of massive stone doors, fastened to the rock by iron hinges. Runes were carved into the doors, the ancient markings as red as fire. He had reached the assembly, the tomb, where the kings of the four lands were interred. He climbed to his feet, hitched up the rucksack and walked to the doors. He studied the markings a moment, then placed one hand carefully upon them and shoved. The door swung open, and Walkabow stepped through. He stood in a giant circular cavern, streaked by greenish light and shadow. Sealed vaults lined the walls. The dead were then closed away by mortar and stone. Statues stood guarding the entombed rulers, solemn and ageless. Before each was piled the wealth of the master in casks and trunks, jewels, furs, weapons, treasures of all sorts. They were so covered with dust that they were barely recognizable. The walls of the chamber loomed upward until they disappeared, the ceiling an impenetrable canopy of black. The chamber appeared empty of life. At its far end, a second pair of doors stood closed. It was beyond that serpent Vogue had lived. The pyre of the dead was there, an altar on which the deceased rulers of the Four Lands lay in state for a requisite number of days before their interment. A set of stone stairs led down from the altar to a pool of water in which Vogue hid. Supposedly the serpent kept watch over the dead. Walker wouldn't have been surprised to learn that he had just fed on them. He listened for a long moment for the sound of anything moving, anything breathing. He heard nothing. He studied the tomb. The Black Elfstone was hidden here, not in the cavern beyond. If he were quick and if he were careful, he might avoid having to discover whether or not the serpent Vogue was still alive. He began moving slowly, noiselessly past the crypts of the dead, their statues and their wealth. He ignored the treasures. He knew from Cogline that they were coated with a poison instantly fatal to anyone who touched them. He picked his way forward, skirting each bastion of death, studying the rock walls and the rune markings that decorated them. He circled the chamber and found himself back where he had started. Nothing. His brow furrowed in thought. Where was the pocket that contained the Black Elfstone? He studied the cavern a second time, letting his eyes drift through the haze of greenish light, skipping from one pocket of shadows to the next. He must have missed something. What was it? He closed his eyes momentarily and let his thoughts reach out, searching the blackness. He could feel something. A very small presence that seemed to whisper his name. His eyes snapped open again. His lean, ghost-like face went taut. The presence was not in the wall. It was in the floor. He began moving again, this time directly across the chamber, letting himself be guided what he sensed, waiting there. It was the Black Elfstone, he concluded. An Elfstone would have a life of its own, a presence that could summon if called upon. He strode away from the statues and their treasures, away from the vaults, no longer even seeing them, his eyes fastening on a point almost at the center of the cavern. When he reached that point, he found a rectangular slab of rock resting evenly on the floor. Runes were carved in its surface, markings so faded that he could not make them out. He hesitated, uneasy that the writing was so obscure. But if the runes were elven script, they might be thousands of years old. He could not expect to be able to read them now. He knelt down, a solitary figure in the center of the cavern, isolated even from the dead. He brushed at the stone markings and tried a moment longer to decipher them. Then, his patience exhausted, he gave up. Using both hands, he pushed at the stone. It gave easily, moving aside without a sound. He felt a momentary rush of excitement. The hole beneath was dark, so cloaked in shadow that he could make nothing out. Yet there was something. Casting aside momentarily the caution that had served him so well, Walkabout reached down into the opening. Instantly, something wrapped about his hand, seizing him. There was a moment of excruciating pain, and then numbness. He tried to jerk free, but he could not move. Panic flooded through him. He could still not see what was down there. Desperate now, he used the magic, his free hands summoning light and sending it swiftly down into the hole. What he saw caused him to go cold. There was no Elfstone. Instead, a snake was fastened to his hand, coiled tightly about it. But this was no ordinary snake. There was something far more deadly, and he recognized it instantly. It was a sphinx, a creature out of the old legends, conceived at the same time as its massive counterparts in the caves without. The sphinxes. But the sphinx was a creature of flesh and blood until it struck. Only then did it turn to stone. And whatever it struck turned to stone as well. Walker's teeth clenched against what saw was happening. His hand was already turning grey. The sphinx still wrapped firmly about it, dead now and hardened, cemented against the floor of the counterpart, in a tight spiral from which it could not be broken loose. Walkabout pulled violently against the creature's grasp, but there was no escape. He was embedded in stone, fastened to the sphinx in the cavern floor as surely as if by chains. Fear ripped through him, tearing at him as a knife edge might his flesh. He was poisoned. Just as his hand was turning to stone, so would the rest of him, slowly, inexorably, until he was a statue.